How does it feel to have lived long enough to see all of your favorite franchises go down in flames?
Feels great.
So clearly, I'm a glutton for punishment, as I've decided to now review the rest of the Halo TV show. And this is despite my first video getting blocked worldwide twice, and even though it's finally back up now, it's still demonetized. Well, I thought the world should know how bad this show is, and that first video, despite getting taken down, was actually very popular. So this time around, I'm going to use very minimal footage, and if it still gets claimed, if the dispute doesn't go through, I will swap to screenshots, of all things. So I'm assuming you guys are with me, let's just ride this out to the end. At this point, I'm just curious how bad it's going to get. And believe it or not, it does get worse than episode 1. Yes, really. At least episode 1 had some entertainment value, especially in the first 15 minutes. Sadly, I don't think there's any real redeeming value left. Unless you're into hate watching something, which I guess now I've been roped into doing for the sake of content. So without further ado, let's continue to watch the Halo franchise's downward spiral. So episode 2 begins with a flashback to Chief's teenage years, where one of his fellow Spartans is trying to leave the base they're stationed on. So this is Chief's buddy Soren. Honestly, with how many changes from the games they've already made, I'm surprised this isn't Sergeant Johnson, which it's really weird that he's mysteriously absent at this point, given that not only is he one of the most popular characters in the series, the funniest character, the one given all the one-liners, but also he's black, so I thought it would be a shoo-in for this woke, diverse show. Really strange exclusion on their part, but maybe they just hate traditionally masculine characters. Wouldn't surprise me. So Chief begrudgingly lets Soren go, but only gives him 5 minutes to escape the planet. So back in the present, we see Chief and Quan Ha flying at warp speed through space and have some conversation that ultimately doesn't matter. And you better get used to seeing Master Chief without his helmet, cause he only wears it for like 2 or 3 minutes in the entire episode. I think the writers are just trolling us at this point. The next scene is on Reach, and we get to see Lord Hood for the first time. I might despise Ron Perlman as a person, but I don't understand why they couldn't just cast him as Lord Hood. Maybe that would be too expensive. And supposedly this show had a budget of $10 million an episode already. But once again, the dialogue is really shitty here. I can't play it for you, unfortunately. Hood just gives Dr. Halsey some advice. Then Chief's buddies from Silver Team have a very short conversation about their missing leader that once again is ultimately meaningless. It's just more padding for the show. Luckily, in the next scene, the plot actually advances as Chief and Quan Ha arrive at some kind of space station in the middle of an asteroid field. And it's funny, in my last video, I pointed out how there were some vague similarities to The Expanse in this show, and now this actually feels straight ripped from it, except this time it makes absolutely no fucking sense. Now, if you haven't seen The Expanse, long story short, humanity has expanded to the outer reaches of our solar system, and the poorest among us have become what is called Belters. These are the people that are basically working the mines in space for resources, and so their space stations look kind of like this. Grimy, cyberpunkish, and eventually those people rise up against their oppressors, and honestly that part of the show is kind of poorly written. But in the context of the Halo show, this makes no sense because this is a den of pirates. You know, more of a science fantasy sort of thing. That would be really cool to see in like Star Wars, or maybe Ratchet and Clank, to name something from my wheelhouse. But in the more realistic Halo universe, this doesn't make any sense because where are these people getting their resources? If they're essentially space pirates, independent in the middle of nowhere, are they trading whatever minerals they're mining from this asteroid to other planets? And if they are, that would leave more than enough of a trail for the UNSC to find them and either kill them or at the very least, they would find out where Chief has gone to fairly easily because there would probably be only a number of locations he could realistically go. And I know I'm reading into this too much, but to me, it's just another example of how the writers didn't really put much thought into the show. Maybe maybe this space station exists in the books or the wider lore that 343 eventually wrote. But as a Halo enjoyer, which to me just means a fan of the games and not the expanded universe, you need to explain this stuff, and they don't explain it. So anyway, the locals don't take too kindly to a Spartan being on their station, so they aim their guns at them, and they block the road using a forklift, and Chief just shoves the forklift out of the way. Kind of a cool little moment. Probably the only one this episode, so I'll give it some credit where it's due. And of course, Soren shows up. I think pretty much everybody predicted that's the reason Chief came here. And I'll admit, Soren's probably the only character I like in this show so far. He's actually charismatic, and he brings some much needed levity to the show when normally we're left with stoic Chief and the charisma vacuum that is Kwan Ha. So Soren explains that he's truly free here, can do whatever the hell he wants, the place is lawless, and they board on some kind of train monorail combo, and I'll admit the city actually looks pretty cool. I've had my minor complaints about the CGI, but the design here is pretty solid. Again, it doesn't exactly look Halo. It feels more like a Fifth Element or, again, The Expanse. This underground, I guess technically not underground, inner asteroid city is pretty well designed. And then the monorail takes them outside of the asteroid to a much smaller rock where his home is. Which again, doesn't make any sense. I mean, why? Again, this is more like science fantasy than science fiction. It's fine for like a high concept universe that has fantastical things, but for one that's supposed to be realistic like it could possibly be our future, I just don't buy this. So then we find out Soren actually has a son. Chief is surprised by this and is told to leave behind his armor, which he should never do, ever. But yes, he takes off his armor and meets Soren's wife, who of course is a white woman, because all media has to have mixed race couples now. You know what, think what you will about it. I have nothing against mixed race couples in reality, but constantly seeing them in commercials and every TV show, you might ask a few questions. So now once again we get to High Charity, and we see the elite that escaped in the first episode is telling what he saw to the three prophets and our mysterious human woman. The elite describes that apparently when Chief touched the relic, he saw a vision of the Halo rings. But how is the elite shown something that not only Chief didn't see, but one of his companions at Silver Team also didn't see, who was right next to him? And as far as we know, she didn't gain any visions from the relic. I don't know, whatever. Okay, so human woman convinces the prophets that she needs to go alone amongst the humans to recover the relic because she can move alongside the humans unsuspected, since obviously as far as they know, there are no humans among the Covenant, because that would make no goddamn sense considering that they want to genocide the humans. And so eventually Mercy caves and lets her go. In the next scene, we are shown UNSC High Command, and Captain Keyes reveals that the Resistance leader guy that we briefly saw in the first episode, who was actually appointed by the UNSC, which makes a lot of sense. This has happened in real life many times with sovereign governments in the US appointing resistance leaders, quote unquote. So the show gets a little bit of credit for that one. But unfortunately, immediately afterward, they shit on classic Halo again, as Dr. Halsey reveals to the room her plan to control the Spartans using Cortana. Unlike the main Halo universe, which I just read the wiki, okay, so I know for a fact they changed this from the games. Smart AI had already existed for 400 years at this point. But in the context of the TV show, apparently Flash cloning brains to make smart AI is developed exclusively just to control Spartans' brains. Are you fucking kidding me? This makes no fucking sense at all, man. The Spartans might be pretty powerful, okay? Worth 100 Marines, as they say in the first episode, possibly way more than that even. But they are not battleships. They are not nukes. They can't glass a planet by themselves. Smart AI would be much better used for what it's actually used for in the games. I mean, Cortana is actually able to find out the Forerunner language and how all their systems work in a matter of minutes in Halo 1. and quickly finds out all their other functionalities within however much time passes in a mission or two in-game. That makes way more sense than just mind controlling a bunch of super soldiers. I'm sorry. This is just fucking stupid. It's more melodrama. Because you already know where this is going. I'm just gonna predict it here, that Cortana is gonna decide, oh, I actually like Master Chief. I don't want to mind control him. And she's gonna rebel. And it's gonna be the dumbest shit ever, dude. I hate this, man. It is so bad. Why would they do this? Why would they change this of all things? It makes no sense. I also want to point out that this scene is 5 minutes long, and only 2 events of importance happen. It's just talking. Unless your dialogue is really well written like the early seasons of Game of Thrones, you can't just have 10 people sitting around the table talking for 5 minutes. Imagine if cutscenes in Halo were like this, and actually if Sony was developing the Halo games, they would be like that. And I feel like I have to say this, no, I am not an Xbox fanboy on any level, trust me. I used to be a Sony fanboy once upon a time. So anyway, next scene, we're back on the planet Madrigal, and we see this evil resistance leader guy that we were just talking about executing a bunch of people, I guess from Quan Ha's part of the resistance. And I want to point out another similarity to The Expanse. This evil resistance leader guy was also in The Expanse and was also evil in that show, but I guess he just kind of has an evil face and has to be typecast as these villainous backstabbing types. And it turns out that Quan Ha was watching the footage of these executions. So yeah, that's a thing, I guess. And she's sad about it. Next, we see Soren and Chief having a conversation about the past. And John is in disbelief that Soren was actually able to have a real life and a family after all the treatments they were given as children. Soren informs him that it's not too late, and there's actually a chip in the back of the Spartans that mutes their emotions and helps them keep focus in combat. Now, I'm sure you've seen this before in other sci-fi things. The first thing that comes to mind is a now likely forgotten game called Haze from the mid-2000s. Sadly, I don't think this is canon either, as far as I can tell, and I'm still undecided if this is more interesting than simply brainwashing kids to be killing machines. The chip just gives them an out, and again, I think they're going to use this for a bad plot point where Master Chief takes the chip out at some point, or maybe Cortana convinces him to do it. That's just a prediction for later. And I do want to point out, too, that the acting is a little bit distracting in this scene. Again, Soren's actor is pretty good. I like the guy, definitely, but Master Chief's is just kind of weird here. I understand that it's difficult to portray a character that has no emotions, especially now that we're seeing his face all the time, so we can actually properly scrutinize the acting. I don't know, man, this guy just isn't Chief. I don't think he's what anybody imagined Master Chief looks like. And they try to add in some comedy a bit later with Soren's son, and Chief's incredibly unenthusiastic reaction to everything, but it's really just not that funny, partially due to writing and partially due to the acting. Then we get 2 completely pointless scenes back to back, and I'm not even going to talk about what happens in them. Once again, we go back to Chief, Soren, and Quan Ha, and they're talking about the Forerunner artifact. And Soren says he knows a guy who actually survived being kidnapped and likely tortured by the Covenant. And so eventually, Chief agrees to go see him. And now we have the scene that completely ruins this episode. Not only is it a major waste of time, being almost 8 minutes long, but it just feels simultaneously very cliche. I mean, you've seen the rambling, crazy guy a million times in other media, and they don't do anything new with it. But even worse, they completely fuck up the major reveal from Halo 1 that the rings are weapons of mass destruction. Yep, already, this early, before we even see the Halo rings, we already know what they do. Why did they reveal this early? I don't fucking know, man. It doesn't make any sense. Almost none of the decisions they made to steer away from the Halo timeline make any sense at all. Many people have pointed this out, and I certainly agree, that this show just feels like yet another case of some Hollywood hack attaching their name to a video game franchise and thinking they can do better. I already went on a rant in my last video about this being exactly why Hollywood should never be able to touch video game franchises, and I don't want to do it again. Honestly, I'm finding it difficult to actually care about anything that's happening anymore, so I can't really fake a huge angry rant for you, because to me, this series already was a giant piece of shit from the first episode, and you can't really come back from that. So honestly, at this point, I'm just here to see how bad it gets, you know? I don't have any personal investment whatsoever. I already knew from episode 1, this would have nothing to do with the game's story. The other stupid thing we learned from this scene is that apparently Master Chief is special. Now, I'm guessing what they mean by this is that he has, like, ancient Forerunner DNA, or DNA from the ancient humans that are apparently something different from the Forerunners, according to Halo 4 onward. I never liked that decision by 343, but whatever, who knows, the show might do its own thing that has nothing to do with either of those two possibilities. Point is, Master Chief and that Covenant woman both have the special power to activate Forerunner relics for some reason. So, after finding out that Halo is a weapon of mass destruction, Master Chief decides he needs his Spartan buddies to stop this. So, he goes back by himself to the UNSC, gets arrested, of course, willingly, and the episode ends with him in a cell with Dr. Halsey talking to him. Okay, do I need to explain to you what's wrong with this? I don't think so. You probably thought exactly the same thing I did by the end of this episode, assuming you even watched this piece of shit. Why did they even bother having Master Chief be a fugitive with Quan Ha at the end of the first episode if they were just gonna reverse that decision by the end of the second? Why even bother? What a fucking waste of time. What a tease. All to just introduce a new character, which admittedly might be the best character in the show, sadly, just for Master Chief to basically just give himself up. And from what I'm guessing, in episode 3, they're probably going to put Cortana inside of him. Now, you might notice my choice of words there. I actually haven't seen episode 3 at the time of me recording this line, so it'll be funny if a bunch of my predictions are wrong by the end of the next episode, but it just makes episode 2 feel like a colossal fucking waste of time. I know it's a pattern in these streaming shows that the first episode and the last episode are usually the highest budget, and as a result, also usually the best episodes in the season. But holy shit, what a drop off from episode 1. Not only is there no action in this episode, and it's like 80 to 90% talking, but also Master Chief has his helmet off for almost the entire thing. And it's just talking, and ultimately, all that was accomplished this episode was Master Chief learning that Halo is a weapon, which is a big reveal, but also shouldn't be in fucking episode 2. Oh, and I nearly forgot to mention that we get to see the Covenant bitch naked for 2 seconds. Again, serves absolutely no purpose, further contributing to the fact that this episode is just padding. But yeah, I guess if you wanted to see her naked, you get to see it for a second. Cool. So yeah, the episode fucking sucks, obviously. Let's move on to episode 3. Now, believe it or not, episode 3 begins with possibly the worst scene in the entire show. And I don't even mean from a faithfulness to the Halo franchise perspective, which of course it's not faithful at all, but even just from a writing perspective. You'll see what I mean in a second. The scene takes place on the planet Oban, a junk planet, I guess. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but once again, this does not fit the Halo aesthetic at all. This is way more cyberpunk, not sci-fi military-esque. Ironically, it would actually fit pretty well in the Alien universe, which of course, as I've said before and we all know, Halo was heavily inspired by Aliens, among some other action movies and sci-fi films. But this grime and extreme poverty, ultra late-stage capitalism, or possibly authoritarian is not Halo. Okay, I'm just gonna move on. So, we see a little boy reading to a little girl about Earth and how great it is. And this boy has already decided that he likes girls and tries to get a kiss out of her. And admittedly, it's actually a pretty cute moment. Unfortunately, the grooming police show up, and the punishment for escaping state-mandated pedophilia is death. Jokes aside, they really just beat a small boy to death for not working on this fucking junk planet. And it is like the edgiest shit I swear I've seen from a TV show in years, dude. It is so poorly handled and unbelievable. Dare I say it's cringe. Ask me how I know a leftist wrote this scene. Well, whether or not you did ask, I'm going to explain anyway. This is the most cartoonish depiction of authoritarianism you can imagine. I mean, really, they're beating children to death. It's the most extreme version of poverty where they're literally sifting through mountains of trash. Again, this isn't fucking Cyberpunk, okay? It's Halo. The Halo trilogy is about hope, about humanity's last stand against extinction. And against all odds, they defeat the Covenant, wipe out the Flood. At least at the time, it seemed like they wiped out the Flood. Of course, 343 had to go and ruin that too, but whatever. And of course, the Halo TV show is the complete opposite, showing the most bleak possible origin for our Covenant girl. Because yes, the Covenant show up and save the little girl before she's also beaten to death or possibly Mamma mia! Whatever fucking super edgy shit these demented writers were thinking. Millennial writers almost always create the bleakest worlds imaginable, even when it has absolutely no place in the subject material, in this case being Halo, of course. So anyway, the Covenant take her on board because they use their magical device that apparently can detect if somebody has this mysterious Forerunner gene or whatever plot device crap they're coming up with that they haven't yet explained. The scene then cuts to the present day where we see Covenant Girl. I don't even know if they've said her name yet. I'm just gonna keep calling her this until they say it again. And she once again is talking about how she's gonna go get this Forerunner key that activates their technology and likely is the key to the ring. And she also says she's gonna bring them Master Chief's head. In the next scene, we see Miranda Keyes and that Admiral chick are talking, and the Admiral tells Miranda that Halo is a weapon, which is what John told Dr. Halsey at the end of the last episode. Apparently, Dr. Halsey was not planning on telling Miranda. Again, this is just drama. I don't think it really matters at all. It just feels like yet another scene that is wasting our time. In the next scene, we see that Dr. Halsey has fully activated the clone, and the clone seems to have all of her memories. I guess she really is an exact copy, and they have kind of an awkward conversation between each other, which results in Halsey telling her clone she's going to become Cortana. Then we see Chief has already been debriefed apparently on the Cortana system, and that he's about to be integrated with her, and we see the clone gets a giant needle in her eye, Dead Space 2 style, which uploads her brain into the system and somehow converts it into what becomes Cortana. Now you can tell they actually tried to appease the fans here because they dragged poor Jen Taylor into this, so Cortana at least sounds like Cortana. Unfortunately, she doesn't look like Cortana. She's not blue, and the actress that plays Halsey doesn't look like Cortana, and they just made it a CGI younger version of her. It's such a weird, small change that makes no sense to me. Was this done for the normies who might stumble upon this show? I can't think of any other reason why they wouldn't make her blue. If anything, it would probably make the CGI look less uncanny. And Halsey tells the newly formed Cortana that she cannot yet fully integrate with Master Chief's systems and essentially forcibly remove his emotions, much like the chip in his back does. I don't know if it's supposed to be a trial run to maybe see if her mind is stable or something, but apparently she's also going to be used to analyze the key to the Halo ring, which once again, that actually makes sense and is sort of faithful to the games in a sense, at least to what her purpose would eventually be in the trilogy. And I know it's gonna sound like I'm nitpicking at this point, but in this scene they jerk off how great Master Chief is. Remember how in the original games, Cortana says she chose Master Chief because of his luck.
But you had something they didn't. Something no one saw but me. Can you guess? luck.
Now in the show, they're just kind of saying Master Chief is the best ever at everything, and I find that significantly more boring than him just being lucky, but that's just me. So actually this scene is pretty okay, probably the best one since that first action scene in the first episode. They even word for word copy Cortana's first words, and the only reason that I know that is because I was reading the wiki. But I guess that's a nice touch for any lore nerds who are still watching this shit, which I guess any fanboy's gonna be watching this to the end. It's really strange to me what they decide to keep from the games and what they decide to throw out. I feel like they're keeping in things that are trivial in the grand scheme of things, and then throwing out the entire fucking appeal of the games. The next scene is another complete waste of time. It takes place back on the pirate station, where Quan Ha wants to go back to Madrigal because Resistance leader guy that was put there by the UNSC signed a peace treaty with them, and so almost all the insurrectionist forces have now surrendered. Quan Ha, being a complete retard, thinks that she single-handedly, alongside maybe tiny resistance cells, can take back Madrigal for her team or whatever. Have we all forgotten that there's a fucking massive alien legion that wants to genocide all the humans? I actually agree with the evil resistance leader guy. Humanity needs to stand together against the Covenant. That only makes sense. And so, of course, Soren just kind of brushes her off and is like, fuck off. No, I'm not going to give you a ship to go back to your stupid planet. And that's the end of the scene. So we swap back to Reach again, and we see that Master Chief is not taking kindly to Cortana. Have your expectations been subverted yet? Where do all these Ryan Johnson clones come from? All these people who want to change something just to alter your expectations. It's not like some kind of big twist in the story that completely recontextualizes the whole thing, like The Usual Suspects or American Psycho. It's just like a random ass, to use a cringe word again, meta change from the original story for no reason. And maybe it's Stockholm Syndrome, but the more I listen to Jen Taylor's voice, the more I'm like slowly losing the urge to criticize this show. But I'm gonna hold firm for you guys. But I'm really losing steam at this point, dude. And the next scene is probably even worse than the first scene of the episode. Oh my god. Okay, so we see a UNSC cruiser in the middle of space, and all of a sudden, a Covenant Corvette comes through slip space, and boom, ship's fucking huge. And instead of firing on the ship or calling for backup, they listen to a distress signal from a lone woman who I guess somehow took over the ship and learned how to activate the fucking warp drive. And they actually believe this. They actually believe it. Are you fucking kidding me, dude? How is this real? I swear to you, Hollywood actually believes the military is retarded. Which, you know what? Our modern military is slowly getting there. But not this dumb, okay? There is no way they would believe a bunch of random ass survivors would kill all the Covenant on board and learn how to operate the ship in an alien language that none of them understand. Of course, it's the Covenant girl. I'm sure you all guessed that as soon as you even saw the ship. How can the show be simultaneously subversive and predictable at the same time? And we see a tease of a hunter. Finally, a new alien species, since we've only been seeing the elites up until now. The next scene is pretty inconsequential. We see Chief and Cortana trying to gather more info from the key or relic or whatever. Nothing of importance happens. So then we go back to the ship again. The UNSC lets the Covenant girl on board. Of course, it was a huge trap, and the hunter worms start coming in through all the vents and shit, and it's certainly a sci-fi horror movie vibe going on here. It's actually kind of a neat scene. I'm surprised that we've never seen the hunter worms attack as just the worms. Do they need the battle armor to function? I'm not sure. Again, I'm not a lore nerd. I said it in the last video. I'll say it again. but this was kind of interesting. I'll give the show some credit here. But the scene is ruined at the end when Covenant Girl has a tiny energy sword under her fingernail, dude. You can't make this up. This is like a fucking anime. Oh. So all the humans on board get killed, and that's the end of the scene. Then we see Chief finally meet back up with his team. They seem to welcome him back with open arms, but then Cortana shows up and ruins everything, at least according to Chief. Chief actually straight up bullies her in this scene. It's a little uncomfortable to watch. I'm not sure if that's the tone they were going for in this scene. It's hard to tell if it's supposed to be comedic or tragic. Regardless of intention, at the end of the scene, I hated Chief more and felt bad for Cortana. So the show shifts to the pirate station once again, and we get yet another completely pointless scene with Quan Ha. Trust me, you're not missing anything. And then we see Chief is trying to find out more info about his childhood, where he potentially grew up, and Cortana decides to help him, and he eventually accepts, which begins to build trust between them. And now we get to the dreaded shower scene. You've probably already seen this on social media. At least I know I've already seen memes of it elsewhere. But yes, we get to see a naked Master Chief, and despite supposedly being a peak physical specimen, I've got to say it, even as a straight man, he just has no ass. And Cortana just awkwardly standing behind him gives me flashbacks of Halo 4, where they were obviously trying to set up a romance between them. She's an AI, it's never going to work unless you give her some kind of body, like Edie from Mass Effect or Curie from Fallout 4. Maybe that's where they're going with this? Whatever, doesn't matter. Point is, Chief's trying to cut out the behavioral chip, and Dr. Halsey actually orders Cortana to help him remove it, to shut him down at a moment's notice if he becomes a problem, and she can simply just put the chip back in. And she wants Chief to trust Cortana, which makes sense. And at the end of the scene, one of Chief's companions apparently witnessed this happening. I wish I knew any of them by name so I could say who it is. It's the blonde one. I just find it funny in the Halo show, the Spartans other than Chief are given no attention whatsoever, and especially given what year this takes place in, they could show off, some Spartan 3s, even if it's not Noble Team, maybe just show off some other ones, or at least give the 3 other Spartans that we see regularly just a tiny bit of development, at least enough that we might remember their names. Is that too much to ask for? Now, the next few scenes are clearly inspired by Equilibrium, and you can't convince me otherwise. Now that the behavioral chip is out of his body, Chief is finally feeling things, so he actually looks around, and it's like he's seeing the world for the first time. And in the subway, there is yet another interracial couple. You can't make this shit up, man. I really don't want to get shadow banned on YouTube, but holy shit, dude. This is where conspiracy theories come from. It is impossible to not notice at this point that they're in every piece of media now. I will let you come to your own conclusions on why that is. So after Chief wanders around what I can only assume is New Alexandria, and he doesn't pet the dog he sees, by the way, which kind of pissed me off. He decides to touch the artifact once again to try and finally figure out what planet he's from. And with the help of Cortana, he finds out that there's a second artifact that was likely buried on that planet. And Cortana tells him that his parents were likely killed by a mysterious plague that was brought in from a ship. So I'm sure we all know already where this is going. Dr. Halsey likely released that plague, or there wasn't a plague at all, and all the inhabitants of the planet were killed, and John was kidnapped for the Spartan 2 program. Some variation of that is likely, I'm sure. Dr. Halsey then barges in, pretends like she doesn't already know exactly what's going on, and agrees to go with Chief to the planet. Then we get yet another Quan Ha scene, where she finally manages to convince Soren to help her overthrow evil resistance guy, convincing him that her family has like a shit ton of money or something. And he figures he might as well go because even if it's a lie, he can simply turn her in for the bounty on her head. Then we see Covenant Girl on board the ship that she took over, and we find out what players of the games already knew, that there is UNSC protocol to wipe out any ship's databanks that gets captured, so the Covenant can't find Earth or Reach or any other human colonies. Then for the final scene, Halsey discusses with her assistant this potential bigger artifact that the key slots into, and the assistant guy implies what I already guessed just a couple minutes ago, that the UNSC, or Dr. Halsey specifically, killed Chief's parents, and they're going to use Cortana, I guess, to suppress his memories or his emotions, or just paralyze him, I guess, if he finds out. And the episode ends implying that there'll finally maybe be some conflict next episode, not just between Chief and Halsey, but also Covenant Chick and Quan Ha and the Resistance, since Covenant Girl is also going to Madrigal. So it's kind of hard to say if episode 3 is the worst one yet. Episode 2 certainly had more padding in it and less events actually happened, and episode 3 actually did have a couple okay scenes. They're both pretty bad. Honestly, the show is getting borderline unwatchable at this point because it doesn't even stand out on its own as just like a sci-fi show with a Halo coat of paint, because there's just no action in it whatsoever. Paramount's Halo show feels like it's going out of its way to shit on the fans a lot of the time. And now after having watched like 3 hours of this crap, I'm finding it really hard to stir up the motivation to give you a proper rant at the end. I just feel defeated at this point. If I wasn't doing this for content, I certainly wouldn't watch it on my own time. My days of hate watching a show are long over. And so now it's just kind of draining on my consciousness. I'm struggling to even think of a good conclusion for this, because it certainly wouldn't be any different than the first episode's conclusion. Show sucks. It's not Halo. You can tell they read details from their supposed Halo Bible that Microsoft or 343 gave them, and they just threw most of it in the trash and kept 2 or 3 ideas that they actually liked. And it's not like I had crazy expectations for this, but if you're gonna have writing this bad, you need to have action scenes, okay? Even in low-budget CW shows, they have like an action scene every episode, because otherwise the audience wouldn't watch the shitty show, period. You made a TV show based on a first-person shooter, where you're shooting things all the time. None of the cutscenes are particularly long, especially, again, compared to Sony exclusives these days. So why is this show 95% talking? I'm really not looking forward to watching the rest of the season, I can tell you that.